Welcome to the Immigrant's Path, showcasing the successes, challenges, and the many paths to America. Brought to you by Sarraf Gentile LLP, a New York-based law firm representing individuals nationwide on immigration and other complex litigation matters.
Hi guys. A bunch of people have reached out to me to ask me about how to come to the US or stay in the US if they're an entrepreneur and their dream is to have a startup and start a company here. So this episode is to go through some of the nuts and bolts options about how to come and stay in the US if your version of the American dream is to come here and start a company. Could not have a better guest today to walk through this. Today's guest is Sophie Alcorn. She is one of the Silicon Valley's favorite startup immigration attorneys, so I can't think of anybody more qualified and more pleasant to talk to go through these topics. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Thank you. All right, welcome everybody. Very, very excited today to have Sophie Alcorn on the podcast. For those of you who are unfamiliar with her, Sophie is the Silicon Valley's go-to immigration lawyer for all issues dealing with startups. She's the founder of the successful law firm Alcorn Immigrating. She's the author of the popular TechCrunch Q&A, Dear Sophie. And also she hosts her own podcast, Immigration Law for Tech Startups. So thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you are so welcome, Joe. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I have so much admiration for everything you do. It's very exciting and scary to sue the government and help people stand up for their rights. So I have a lot of admiration for people who do it.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So first, can you just tell us a bit about your firm and the services that you offer?
Happy to. Thank you. Well, I'm the founder of Alcorn Immigration Law. We are based out of Mountain View, California, and that's in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. And we help people from all over the world and individuals currently in the US to get visas, green cards, and citizenship in the United States. And our primary focus is to help technology professionals. So that includes startup founders, investors, employees at rapidly scaling technology companies, and of course, their families, so that all those folks can have peace of mind and have the energy and bandwidth to focus on the thing that's actually driving them, which is, innovation and making the world a better place. So we're somebody called me one of America's bouncers once, but I would rather think of it as an obstacle remover to help you be able to follow your dreams. So that's what we do. I founded the firm about it's almost our 7-year anniversary. Wow. When I was in my kitchen with toddlers and trying to make baby food and help people get visas late at night. And we've grown, and now we have a team of about 20, and we've helped thousands of people and represent hundreds of companies for their U.S. immigration needs.
In looking at your website, I did see one offering that stuck out as pretty unique for immigration firms, and that's the Extraordinary Ability Bootcamp. Yeah. I haven't seen something similar to that before, so if you could just give us a quick description of what that is. I'm curious myself what the parameters of it are.
Thank you. I'm happy to. So this was my first foray into online education. And fortunately now there's a brand new regulatory program for international startup founders to be able to get up to 5 years of status to lead startups in the United States. It's called International Entrepreneur Parole. And if a company is less than 5 years old and in the last 18 months has received at least $265,000 of qualified investment from US tech investors, they can qualify. So that helps a lot of startup founders come here now. But for most of my practice, The options for startup founders were extremely limited because this program kind of just went online starting last May with the Biden administration. And so there's this real burning desire in a lot of people's hearts to be able to move to the US and start companies. And if you're not already famous in your home country and you don't have $200,000 for an E2 or, whatever, $1 million for an AB5, whatever the current numbers are, and if there's no company willing to sponsor you to work for them, or you don't want to work for a company, and plus there's the H-1B lottery, it's really hard for brilliant people early stage in their careers to be able to bootstrap their immigration journey and come here without needing to marry somebody. So the point of Extraordinary Ability Bootcamp is to help anybody, but primarily, the most people that I see who go for these options, there's the O1A visa for extraordinary ability, which is a temporary 3-year status that could be indefinitely renewed. There's the EB1A green card for extraordinary ability, which really helps backlogged people born in China or India who are waiting potentially decades for their employment-based green cards. With that status, they can jump the line. And also folks who just, want to get a green card based on their own merit and what they can contribute to the United States. So the EB2 national interest waiver green card for people with master's degrees or exceptional ability and who are working in the national interest. So I love these options because you can do it by yourself based on your accomplishments. But then the question became, I really want this. It's my only way, but I'm not qualified. So how do I do it? And so over the years, I struggled to, consult with people and be like a coach or advisor and now publish some more articles and now go find a competition to judge. And it wasn't accessible for the people who really needed it, because why, if you're at the beginning of your career or you're struggling to leave a mark, you're probably not going to have the budget to pay an attorney at their hourly rate to, check in with you every few months about how your progress is going. So that's the genesis. So it's an online class. It's 15 videos that I recorded, and it goes through how we as lawyers think about the evidence we need to qualify for one of these cases. And if somebody doesn't have enough of one category yet, what are some things that they can do by themselves? It sounds like it's bootstrap their accomplishments.
It's perfect for the person that has a really long-term mindset about what they want to accomplish and how they're going to get there.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily for the person that's just, it's occurred to me, eureka, I have my idea, I need to do this tomorrow. But for the person that's really planning it out, it sounds ideal.
And it's if somebody has the idea for a startup that they're maybe beginning in their home country now, they could, a lot of the things that the government will recognize are really part of a marketing plan for your business, right? So when I was first doing extraordinary ability cases, I was like, I need to be able to talk to my clients at eye level. I need my business to check all these boxes too. I actually used it as a PR marketing roadmap for several years to check off all the different categories.
I mean, just as a fellow practitioner and business owner, what I really like about it is that if you look at the law broadly, and immigration law probably specifically, it has an almost transactional feel to it with a lot of the interactions with lawyers. And this is really a way to introduce a non-transactional relationship with people, to be a long-term presence and counselor in their life and really build very good relationships. So I think that's, I don't know if that's what you're aiming for, but it just,
well, you hit on something that I deeply believe in, which is even at a big tech company, this is still a very human individual experience. And you see the pain that people go through when they're in situations where they need to become a whistleblower, or this thing that they have relied on isn't happening yet, and their life is on hold. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, we're helping people. And so I think this, stems from my belief in that.
It's a good segue into my next question. So you've built an extraordinary brand in a very short period of time, especially for a law firm.
Thank you.
So how would you describe your brand?
Our brand is human,
Mhm.
and it's based on really four different pillars, which are our core values. And I know that can sound cheesy, but I put a lot of time and thought into this. You know, it's about integrity, creativity, compassion, and expertise.
Mhm.
So integrity, we're always trying to do the right thing. Creativity, we're solution seekers, not problem solvers. It's very deliberate with the language. We create solutions. You know, compassion, not only like, of course, for our clients, which I think is novel in many law practices, but for each other and even ourselves with the whole oxygen mask thing, and expertise. Immigration law is constantly changing. We always need to be alert and focused and pay attention to the changes and help guide our clients through that in real time. And so our brand is about that. Our brand is about humans who are, you know, following their hearts, the rebels and the change makers and the people who have a vision for what this world can be like and how we can support each other to create that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I mean, I also imagine there's a lot of mutual identification with people that are in the startup industry with somebody who, like yourself, is in the process of kind of, I don't know if startup 7 years in is the right word, but certainly a young growing enterprise.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I imagine that has
absolutely.
to help too.
It's super fun and inspiring. And you know, my dad was an immigration lawyer, and he definitely had that rebel spirit of he loved being like David versus Goliath in immigration court, helping save people from deportation and keeping families together. So he instilled that in me just through, you know, witnessing his life. And in terms of, you know, starting my practice, I needed to make it work right away. I was, you know, looking at being a single mom in Silicon Valley, and, you know, there's, sometimes life makes you do what, you know, you got to do to make things happen. So, but it was also fun for me because I love being a lawyer, and I also love the creative parts of myself and getting to think in that way.
And
So
did
it's fun to create.
is the business acumen something that you kind of knew that was there before you started the firm, or is that something that got revealed later on in life?
I didn't know. Like, I didn't know it was okay to have those parts of myself, because in my family there was such a focus on, you know, like winning at the Ninth Circuit or the Third Circuit or something. And but looking back, I discovered an old box of like middle school projects where I was really artsy, and I found I grew up in California, so we had, you know, the missions, and then another part of our California history was about the like the leather trade and the boats coming around Cape Horn, or to like get the hides and bring them back and sell them in the 1800s. So I read the book The Pilgrim, which is like an autobiographical account of that, and my homework was to like make a brochure, and I had this like very intense, you know, front back color images. Welcome to California in the 1800s. Here's why you should move to the land of opportunity. So I was apparently marketing moving to California since I was like 11 years old, apparently.
You've been at it for a while then.
Yeah.
All right. So, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because I wanted to do an episode geared towards either new immigrants or prospective immigrants that their American dream is starting a company. And I can't think of anybody better to kind of go through the options of that than you. So I've gone through some of the stuff that you've already written and spoken about the different options for folks looking to start a company. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to just go through some of them. I know
Let's
each
do
one
it.
of these could be their own podcast episode alone. So if we could just go through kind of, I guess, the basic qualifications and maybe the pros and cons of the different potential approaches.
Yeah. Like
Um,
who it would help, or who is it good for, who could start
yeah,
thinking about it. Yeah, that
exactly.
sounds great.
So the first one is something you already alluded to earlier in the interview, which is the IEP, or the International Entrepreneur Parole. I don't know if program's the right word for it, but that, and hopefully the Like Act, which I know
Right.
you've had a hand in,
Yeah.
and you're a big supporter of, which hopefully comes online and solidifies this. So if you could just walk through, I guess, IEP,
Yeah.
who that
who's
would
it-
be for, and
who
the
is it good
pros and
for?
cons of it.
Absolutely. So if you have a US company that's less than 5 years old,
Mhm.
it's often a tech startup, but doesn't have to be. It's often a corporation created in Delaware, but it doesn't have to be. And if you own at least 10% of the equity in that company, and if your company has either raised at least the new adjusted for inflation amount is about $265,000 from qualified US investors. So that would be people like serial angel investors or venture capital firms. And you want to be in a leadership role like the CEO or CTO, then you can qualify for this new program, International Entrepreneur Parole. You'll be able to come for 2.5 years. If you still qualify, get a 2.5-year extension. Your spouse can come, your kids can come, your spouse can apply for a work permit, and you're allowed to run your company. So it's a fabulous option. It does require that you already have the US company and you've already raised money. If you don't have $265,000 raised yet, then you could also look at getting US federal, state, or local grants to your company of about $100,000. Or if you have either some grants or some US qualified investors, then they'll also consider other things like patents or crowdfunding or rapid hiring, other things to show your growth potential.
Right.
So fabulous new program.
Just one thing, if you could speak just a little bit louder, because I'm in a not so quiet part of Manhattan, and sometimes I get some street traffic behind me, so I miss a few words here and there.
Okay, so happy to. And the one other thing about IEP that's weird is it's a regulatory program. It's not a real non-immigrant status, so you don't get a visa. And ultimately, if you're in the US, you're going to have to pop out to Canada or go to San Diego and drive across the border with Tijuana for a few hours and come back in to activate the status. Or if you're like in Australia, you're going to have to go get something called a boarding foil in your passport to come here. If you're in India, where the consulates are closed and it's super backlogged, I don't know, maybe you go to Mexico as a tourist and try to drive in. So
there, given the fact that this is not legislative, is there a risk with this, that if the next election there's a new president,
risk.
there is. So there's the possibility.
That's why we need the Like Act. But think of all the H-4 work permit litigation that we've seen. It's basically the same, right? And so this program already has a huge litigatory history where Obama created it, Trump tried to cancel it, the National Venture Capital Association sued. The federal judge said that the cancellation was a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act because there wasn't enough notice and comment period. The program was forced to technically be alive, but it was just like barely eking by on life support. About 30 people applied, but the government pummeled them with requests for evidence. So most people just gave up and withdrew their cases. And ultimately one guy got through, and then nobody else wanted to apply for several more years. But it's back. The Biden administration likes it. But yes, ultimately we do need a real congressional law about a visa.
It sounds like such a no-brainer that this should exist, because just as an outsider, I don't represent startups. It sounds like a lot of the potential solutions that are out there are, I don't know if square peg and round hole is the right way to describe it, but it's kind of like oblique about how to get there. And this is just direct to the point, tailor-made.
It's so clear. And in the Like Act, if and when it becomes law, it basically takes the same criteria. You could stay for up to 7 years instead of 5 years. There's a green card route where you can self-petition for a green card with no visa bulletin and wait times. Your colleagues can even get employee startup visas, a few of them based on the size of your company. It's a no-brainer. And I really hope I'm pulling together people who want to form a coalition and advocate for this, because it is such a no-brainer. This has the capacity to create, ultimately tens of thousands of jobs per year for Americans. And so, the tax consequences of that are amazing. And just the products and services, the life-saving cures that this will help foster. It is very simple.
Are you optimistic it's going to pass?
I think it's the easiest law to get bipartisan agreement about
within the immigration sphere.
Yeah. But the entrenched interests lobbying for immigration reform for the last 20 years, there's this very careful alliance between labor and farm workers and family and removal and asylum and children and all of these things. And so those folks aren't necessarily interested in upsetting the balance with a new group of people who are shiny and who might, disrupt immigration reform.
It's a shiny bargaining chip to use, and you don't want to use it at the wrong time, and so it gets caught up in the horse trading morass of.
And I just want to bypass the horse trading morass. I mean, I realize that there are many critical things, like what are we going to do with all the dreamers? And I have a lot of respect for the urgency of that. But I almost feel like for the last 2 decades, continuing to group all of these immigration things together, we can't get anything done.
Nothing gets done. So the results should, it's, I don't know, probably time for a new approach. But, so the next, that to me seems like what you've just described is the gold standard option, especially if it becomes legislation.
It's really wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to help a lot of people.
Okay, Sophie, welcome back. So we've had a bit of a hiatus due to some technical difficulties, so hopefully that won't happen again. For the sake of continuity, I wore the same shirt, so hopefully.
Oh, amazing! I did not
continue the flow. I think my facial hair is a little longer, but
I think my hair changed color, Joe. So there's so much continuity we can provide.
Yeah, well, it's the best we can do. So, all right. So we were going over the options that an immigrant would have if they want to start a business in the U.S. And I think we finished going over IEP and potentially the Kind Act after that.
Okay.
And we were
Like Act,
I'm sorry. We were just going to start on H-1B as a potential option. So how can an immigrant use an H-1B to start a business here?
So this is where it starts getting more complicated. And there's, when we go into these more standard, more traditional non-immigrant business immigration pathways, this is where a lot of them have restrictions that aren't necessarily favorable to early stage startup founders, especially, but they can be used. So For example, an H-1B is a work visa. It typically lets somebody be an employee at a company for up to 6 years, and there's a way to get extensions beyond that if you're waiting for your turn in line for a green card. So that helps folks born in India and China who face longer green card backlogs. And the H-1B has a couple of requirements that will shape the way a founder will structure their company to be compliant. So the first is this concept of an employer-employee relationship. The next is the ability to pay, and then the next is specialty occupation. So for the employer-employee relationship, if somebody is going to own 100% of the equity and there's no external board of directors, and I think there's no way that that could be approved by the government for an H-1B. There has to be, and there's a whole legal litmus test for this, but essentially other people need to have the ability to hire, control the person's employment, promote them, or discipline them, and potentially fire them. And so for startup founders, what that often turns into, though it's not required, is either the founder has less than 50% of the equity, or there's some work that can be done with a corporate lawyer to separate out the equity from the voting rights and the control with maybe a board or different directors. So that, that depends on.
And in that scenario, if the immigrant is essentially giving, let's say, their co-founders or a board the ability to fire them, is there anything other than just really completely trusting your co-founders or the board? Is there any mechanisms that they could typically put in place to give them some protection from getting fired?
No, because
Okay.
I think that would contradict the USCIS requirements for an H-1B, but they can still own their equity, right? And the other thing I tell founders is, at more advanced stages of funding with more aggressive VCs backing you, it's not uncommon for founders to be kicked out of their own companies when they reach a certain level of revenue. So you're going to have to give up control anyway. So if you want to start the company, you might as well just embrace it at the beginning if it's your only option.
Right.
And then the other things just to keep in mind are ability to pay. So there is a minimum prevailing wage. We can reduce the number of hours. It doesn't have to be full-time work, but then you're really not supposed to work beyond that, right? So, and the company does, it can be pre-revenue, but there needs to be runway money in the bank account to fund the operations for a certain amount of time for the period of the H-1B. So that's important. So there's, a higher pay required than for other types of non-immigrant statuses with the H-1B. And then the last one was the occupational classification. What type of job are you going to do? I think it's pretty straightforward for somebody with a master's degree in electrical engineering to get a CTO title and be the head engineer at a company. That's pretty standard for a founder at a tech company. But where it gets more tricky, for example, is like the CEO classification, because USCIS can push back and say that's not a professional job. It doesn't require a bachelor's degree. So just have to be careful navigating the H-1B, but it is possible.
And one thing, if I understand correctly, that's in the positive side of the ledger for the H-1B route is that you could already be here on an H-1B for another company that you don't own and concurrently apply for an H-1B for your startup.
Yeah.
Right. And you wouldn't necessarily have to subject yourself to the lottery again if you came here originally through the lottery.
And that's the most standard way. Founders who never had an H-1B, it's probably not worth it to try to go through the lottery. But if you're already working in a big tech company and you want to switch away and take control of your destiny and start your own company, that's the common situation that we typically help people navigate.
Okay. Is there anything that somebody can do if they, let's say they aren't in the US yet, they haven't gone through the lottery, to have concurrent H-1Bs?
Yes, there is. That is an alternative option. there is something with cap exempt concurrent H-1Bs that we often use. So typically for most private companies, there is a lottery that has about a 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 chance of somebody being selected to get an H-1B each year. The lottery's in March, the start date is in October. If you got a master's or PhD in the US, you have a higher chance of getting selected. But a lot of people don't get selected. And so if you're overseas and you need to come here sooner than waiting for March, or you can't deal with the randomness, the plan B is to have 2 jobs. The first job is not subject to this cap or lottery. And then your second job, you're allowed to work at concurrently, even if it's at a private company. So, for example, if you work at a university, you would not be subject to the cap. If you work at a nonprofit research institution, you would not be subject. And for our purposes, the most common thing we use is if you work at a nonprofit affiliated with a university. So there's a way to, one particular program that does this is called Open Avenues. I've, interviewed them and I have one of my podcasts about it, but to boil it down to the essence, startup nominates candidate/founder to be a global talent fellow at Open Avenues, to lead a micro internship or project-based learning for US college students in a field such as software engineering, computer science. Other fields are possible too. Once that is set up, Open Avenues will sponsor the candidate for a 5-hour-a-week H-1B to work with those students on group projects that will advance the company's interests. So you get a team of students supporting you. Once the person is in the US doing that 5-hour-a-week H-1B job, then the startup can file a second concurrent 35-hour-a-week H-1B for the candidate to work the remainder of the time at the company. So we've done that for a lot of people, and it's a great way to keep moving forward when the H-1B is the best option and you don't have time and you can't take the risk to mess around with the lottery.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to give that explanation because I've seen you describe this before, and this strikes me as one of the most creative things I've heard in the startup space that I do not hear many attorneys that work in your area describe. So,
thank you.
Yeah,
it's really exciting. We've helped a lot of people with this program, and it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, it's really creative.
And the government is fully aware of all of this, and they are approving them. So it's great.
Yeah. All right. So we could spend a whole podcast just on the H-1B angle, but we have a few other options to go through. So we'll just try to do the 101 for a few other ones. So the next I have on my list as a possibility is the E2 visa, which I understand would be available to people from some countries, but not others. There are some major countries, people from major countries that wouldn't be able to take advantage of this. But so if you could describe the E2 option, that'd be great.
Absolutely. The E2 is a visa for investors and employees at companies in the US that are owned at least half by people from countries where the countries have treaties of trade and investment with the United States. So China and India do not have investment treaties with the United States, so their citizens do not qualify. I've heard of Chinese people getting citizenship in Grenada or Turkey to try to qualify for E2s. Essentially, let's say, I don't know, I see this a lot with companies from Japan and Germany and Italy. Let's say you're the founder. There's a couple of ways it can work. I typically recommend that there's at least a $100,000 investment into the US company. That's not legally required. You can get approved with less. You're safer if you have more. But that seems like if you've invested and spent, that's the key, spending at least that capital on the US operations before you apply for the visa. It's sort of like a chicken and egg thing, but if the government State Department consular officers don't believe that you're sufficiently committed, they're not going to issue the visa. So you have to spend the money first. And you're allowed to visit as a B1, B2, or ESTA visitor in the meantime while you're setting up operations. So the people who can qualify are the investor who's investing their personal capital into the business, but also, let's say it's a subsidiary of an abroad company, where the parent company in, like, I don't know, Sweden is investing $150,000 in the US startup to get US market access, and it's a wholly owned subsidiary, like that would work. And the CEO could transfer, not as the investor, or maybe as the investor, but also as an essential employee. You can also use it in the Sweden example, like any Swedish software engineer who needs to come to the States and work with you, even if they've never worked for you in the past, could tag along and get a visa as well. And there's also a way, instead of cash, to use intellectual property as the investment. So if you can prove through some sort of valuation that the IP, is worth that, like 100K or more, then that's a way to qualify for the E2 as well.
And this provides a non-immigrant visa, correct? So this does not necessarily lead to a green card.
Yeah, but there's a lot of green card pathways that people on E2 can still qualify for. So for example, employees could still get a normal EB2 or EB3 green card going through the perm process. A CEO might still qualify for an EB1C as a multinational executive transferring from one branch of the government to another. A founder could still get an EB2 national interest waiver green card or an EB1A green card. So there's a variety of possibilities still. You don't have to have a visa that directly leads to a green card, because there's still many to choose from.
And so for this type of visa, if I'm considering starting a company, I imagine my chances of approval will be greater if from the outset I have a very clear path to how this company monetizes and becomes profitable at some point in the relatively near term, right?
Yeah, you have to show a business plan showing that you'll have more than marginal profitability within 5 years, how many US citizens and permanent residents you're going to be hiring. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And so the next option, another non-immigrant visa, the O1 visa or the O1A for people with extraordinary ability. Can you just describe how that visa could be used by someone considering starting a company here?
We use it for a lot of startup founders, a lot of CEOs. We see people being successful at it from a variety of backgrounds. The most common are either academia with research or entrepreneurship as a serial entrepreneur founder. So there's vastly different evidence that each of those people would use, but essentially you're getting several letters of recommendation from experts in your field attesting that you're at the top of your field. So maybe you're like at the very top of cryptocurrency in Italy or something in the fintech space, right? So it's a narrow field. And then there's 8 criteria. You have to use the letters and other evidence to show that you meet at least 3 of them. And common qualifiers are getting professional monetary awards in a competition you've been judged in at the professional level, or having newspaper articles about you and your inventions. If you have an academic background, writing peer-reviewed articles and getting them published and having citations to them are very common. Perhaps having patents, or judging startup pitch competitions, having a high valuation for your company. So there's lots of ways to do it, and that's a very, very common option. And it can be very useful for people born in India or China as an intermediate pathway to getting an EB1 green card for extraordinary ability to bypass a lot of the green card wait times for people from those countries.
And is there any limitation on the amount of times I could renew an O visa?
No, it's indefinitely renewable. The initial term is a 3-year increment. At that point, you can either apply for a brand new O1 for another 3 years, which will be subject to high scrutiny again, or you can renew the original one in 1-year increments.
Okay. All right. You had mentioned there's kind of a green card version of an O visa in a sense.
Yeah,
The
that's the EB1A.
the
Also for
EB1A,
extraordinary
and
ability.
from what I understand, under the green card umbrella, there's a few options. It's not just the
Yeah,
EB1A.
yeah.
Can you
There's
just
5 categories. So EB stands for employment based, as I'm
right?
sure you know. Um, and it's the order of preference in which the US dishes out the limited number of green cards per category per country of birth per year. And so the highest preference, the people at the very front of the line, are in the EB1 category. Those people never need to go through something called a labor certification, a perm process where a company would have to test if there's any Americans to replace that immigrant to do the job instead. And so
And no pun intended, or maybe it is, but that's a laborious process.
it is a laborious
Yeah.
process. Yeah, I love it too. I've
Yeah.
actually never heard that one before.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
There we go. So the EB1 is divided into 3 subcategories. EB1A for extraordinary ability, very similar to an O1, a little harder to get, also used by artists, has 10 criteria instead of 8. The EB1B is for outstanding researchers and professors, either at universities or in the research arm of a company. And the EB1C is like an L1 visa for people transferring between branches of companies, and that is for managers and executives. And so if you can fit into one of those, it's great. And if you can't, then you go and you look at EB2, and that's where so most companies sponsoring employees typically do an EB2 for people with master's or higher or equivalent experience, and an EB3 for people with college degrees. And both require this laborious perm process where you have to advertise the job and recruit Americans and see if there's anybody qualified to do the job instead. And only if there isn't anybody essentially able, willing, and qualified, then you get to like proceed with the other steps of the green card process for the candidate. So the other workaround often used by startup founders, if they're not born in India or China, or if they can be in a different category, perhaps they married a spouse not born in India or China, is an EB2 national interest waiver. And if you don't have a master's degree, there's a way to focus on your abilities to prove that you also do a really good job in your field, but the standard is a lot lower than an EB1A. So that's the most common green card path for startup founders sponsoring themselves who are not born in India or China. And if you're born in India or China, then we'll probably do the EB1A instead.
And it's called exceptional ability?
Yeah,
which is the lower standard? Okay.
Yep.
So is that something that's usable for somebody that has expertise in a relatively new field? So you mentioned crypto before. So crypto hasn't been around all that many years. So there's not, I mean, to my knowledge, there's not many people, if any, that have master's degrees or PhDs in crypto or have been working on crypto for 10 years. So they've developed expertise really in a, on a short runway. Is this something that would be available for those folks, or potentially available?
Absolutely. You get to define the field, and as long as it's not a vice or illegal under federal law, like cannabis, then it could work. And the criteria, you need to show 3 of like 7 or something. And for example, if you have a degree in the field, or if you have 10 years of experience, or if you have a certification or license, or if you get a high salary. I mean, the ones we use the most for early stage startup founders in weird fields are high salary, joining professional associations, and being recognized by your peers. And so that proves exceptional ability. And then the national interest portion is really just like, It can be anything, but it's like there's a three-pronged legal approach, and you're showing this individual is unique, has the skills to move this thing forward. This thing will either help America by creating jobs or saving the environment or saving people's lives, and and therefore it makes sense to bypass the process of finding an American to substitute for them.
And along those lines, are there any special ways to use this if you're a physician? So if I'm a physician and I'm looking to start my own practice in the US, are there any, because that seems like really well aligned with national interests. So is there anything for them?
There is some
My understanding is this, you could
there's something with a special schedule that certain healthcare practitioners use to bypass perm, like nurses, because there's a shortage. So they get to go through a separate certification process that I don't do too much.
Yeah.
But let's say a doctor isn't eligible for that one. I think a medical doctor who's licensed in the US and not subject to like a 212E thing for their for when they get their certifications. I think a doctor starting a practice could absolutely.
Yeah, what I had in mind, I had something rattling around in the back of my head that they had, if they're willing to or have worked for 5 years in a medically underserved area, or they work for like the VA or some other public interest area like that, then they have a separate qualification. But
and I think that is the Conrad 30 waiver program for medical doctors who are subject to the J1 2-year foreign residency requirement. So it's a way to not have to go home for 2 years.
One other potential tool I've seen discussed before is, if you have let's say you have a company overseas, pick a country, are you able to use an L visa in any way to start a business here?
Yeah, so that I mentioned that briefly with the EB1C green card. The L1 visa is very similar. The L1A is for managers and executives, and the L1B is for employees with specialized knowledge. And that has been adjudicated with heavy scrutiny by the USCIS employees for probably at least 5 years now. So if the foreign company has less than 5 to 10 employees, it's going to be very difficult these days for a founder to get that approved. But let's say, the foreign company has 30 people and the US company has 10 people, that's probably going to be very straightforward of a case. But for early stage startups, that can be a hard standard to meet. And it's also not a real, it's like an implied standard from the adjudication averages, but it's not actually anything that's like written anywhere that's a law. So you kind of need a little bit bigger of a company to be able to pull that off.
Got it.
But there is a way for a startup to qualify for a 1-year L1 if the US company is just launching their US domestic operations, but then you need the business plan, and it's also you still need to show that you have a substantial entity abroad to qualify.
Okay. All right, we covered a lot of ground very, very efficiently. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we've gone over the IEP route, the H-1B route, E2 route, the O-1A route, the EBs, let's call them, the potential L route. Is there anything else that's commonly used that we've left out?
I think those are the biggies.
Okay.
Occasionally for employees, I see people using J's for 12-month internships or 18-month training programs, but you got to go back home at the end. They're not really ideal, but the benefit was that during COVID, it sometimes was easier to get a J visa interview than another visa interview, but I wouldn't recommend those for founders for sure.
Okay. And If any of these options resonated with somebody that's looking to act, what would be the best way to get in touch with you if they wanted to consider using your firm
Thank you.
services?
Thank you so much. Happy to provide the link for your show notes, but
Okay.
basically just reach out to us through our website, alcorn.law, and there you can either call us or click on the contact button and put in your details and your question, and
Mhm.
we'll be super happy to connect with you. Also on, we're on social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. And if you go to our website, there's a variety of educational resources as well, including my podcast that you generously mentioned, Immigration Law for Tech Startups, and our live webinars that are open to the public, and all of our blogs and my TechCrunch articles, as well as some other resources.
Yeah.
So we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, and the podcast is awesome. I mean, you could get a master's degree in business immigration just listening to your podcast. Really,
oh, that's an interesting idea.
it's very informative. So thank you for sharing all that.
Thank you.
Anything we haven't gone over? Anything I haven't asked that you'd like to share before we go?
Thank you. I guess in summary, everybody complains that U.S. immigration is super hard, but if you have a goal and you know where you want to be, there are so many ways to chart the path forward, and it might not be instant, but you can definitely make it happen. So I would just like to leave everybody with the sense of hope that yes, this is possible.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And especially thank you for coming back for round 2 after we had our technical difficulties. So really appreciate you taking the time to do this. So I think it'll be really, really helpful for a lot of our listeners that are considering, their version of the American dream is starting a business here. So thank you.
Oh, such a pleasure. Thank you. You're a wonderful host, and I'm grateful to be on here with you. Thank you.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.